I've been given the honour of introducing our keynote speaker for the conference, Dr. Rachel Muers, who's Senior Lecturer in Christian Studies at the University of Leeds. Among many other things, she's the incoming President of the Society for the Study of Theology, the main theological society in the UK, and she's published on a wide variety of topics in both Christian ethics and theology. Just to mention her important contributions to Bonhoeffer studies, she has a forthcoming chapter in the Bonhoeffer handbook, which is one of my favourite chapters, and just does an excellent job of laying out Bonhoeffer's anthropology in conversation with a number of his major works. And to highlight something else, Bonhoeffer figures prominently in Rachel's first book, Keeping God's Silence, Towards a Theological Ethics of Communication. I partly wanted to mention that because I don't remember the first time I met Rachel, but I do remember the first time I didn't meet her. Specifically, I'd just been reading this book and found myself at a Bonhoeffer dinner in Atlanta and saw Rachel and somehow recognised her from her profile, but was just far too intimidated to go up and introduce myself.
How ridiculous is that?
Given this extraordinary book I just worked through. And now knowing Rachel a little better, I realise she's less intimidating than her rigorous theological work I might suggest. But please join me in thanking Rachel Muers for...
I don't quite know what to make of that. Also, especially the fact that I'm more intimidating in theory than in practice, and maybe this means I should make myself less available to my students, and then they'll all be intimidated. I don't quite have that. I'm going to, if I may take a minute to just do a couple of adverts before I start the paper. I have put some handouts on the back table about a conference that we're having in Leeds in a couple of weeks' time, which is an interesting link to this one because it's an academic public church crossover conference on faith in political action today. But the keynote speaker is Jennifer McBride, whose work's been mentioned a few times today, and who's obviously a really significant Bonhoeffer scholar. And what's exciting is to have been able to bring her to this country to speak to an audience of theology students, church people, activists, and so on about faith and political action. So it's a little way away from here, but if anybody feels like making the journey down, assuming they've actually got some trains running by then, be most welcome. The other thing I want to say is, please, since Michael's so generously mentioned the Society for the Study of Theology, please come to the Society for the Study of Theology. Look us up on the website, come along. Seriously, this kind of conversation and this kind of generous and open and informed and rigorous engagement with topics of shared concern, with this sense of the bridging of the historical and the contemporary, is part of exactly what we're trying to, what I love about Society for the Study of Theology and what we're really trying to foster. So if you've enjoyed the experience of this conference, please look out for SST in the spring. I have chosen to focus this paper on thinking with Bonhoeffer theologically about truth and trust, and with particular focus on institutional contexts of truth and trustworthiness. Now, this is partly cheating a bit and going back to the book that Michael mentioned, because I've been slightly obsessed with Bonhoeffer and communication and truth ever since then. Also because I think truth doesn't or shouldn't go out of fashion, so it should always be a good topic for Bonhoeffer's contemporary voice. There might be some reasons to care about it, particularly in a contemporary context, some of which have already been mentioned today. If I can advance the slides, then you can see some of them. This is giving you some of the things that were going on in the back of my mind when I was starting to plan this paper. There's the obvious concern about fake news. What my analytic philosophy colleagues get very, very angry when anybody talks about as a post-truth era. No, you're not allowed to say it's post-truth. You know, we've been working for centuries on what truth is. You're not allowed to just take it away like that anyway. Actually, more in the forefront of my thinking on these issues were a series of events that might provoke a crisis of trust within major institutions, and to which issues about truth-telling and accountability and communication and responsible speech were central. So, for example, the institutional inquiry into child sexual abuse, which you've got independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which you've got listed there, and various similar related phenomena internationally. And a steady trickle of troubling stories about cultures of mistrust, problems with having forms of accountability that don't end up in scapegoating and blame in relation to the National Health Service in particular. So that's the slide that you've got there. That's the Hadiza Babagawa case, if anybody knows about that. If you don't worry about it. I'll say what we need to later. But the issue, the point is, we've got in the background going on a set of questions about the relationships between truth and trust and accountability and how these are structured in institutions. And I really want to thank our friend who mentioned the point about mandates earlier, because the other thing that's going on in the back of my mind is that I've been struck for some time by how little theological work there is about institutions other than church institutions. We're in a UK context. Very few people think theologically about a national health service. You know, it's the nearest thing we've got to a national religion that isn't Christianity, if you see what I mean. But there's almost nothing thought theologically about how that's understood. That's odd. That's interesting. And it seems to be at least plausible that a theologian like Bonhoeffer has something to say about them, not least because of the structure of thinking about the mandates, which is something I'm going to come on to later. Now, I had a few preliminary comments about what it means to hear Bonhoeffer's contemporary voice, but actually Kevin's raised a lot of the key issues, so go through this quite quickly. So we know about the tendency to appropriate him from one side or another in any significant political or church political conflict. It's something I sometimes ask myself, is just how much the Bonhoeffer scholars gathered here think it's their collective responsibility to intervene when people claim a Bonhoeffer moment, at least to try and help people come up with minimally stupid answers to the question, what would Dietrich do? But I think what Kevin showed us is probably a slightly better way, which is to find ways of thinking theologically about how Dietrich's voice is just one voice among many. There's no reason to assume every faithful Christian should do what he would do, not least because, as Kevin's already highlighted, what he does is, from his own point of view, as much something that's forced by feels like something that's forced by external circumstances, comes out of desperation rather than being, you know, a planned model that others can aspire to. And that can still be the case, and it still be the case that one can learn something by paying attention to him. One of the reasons I suppose I'm most concerned about figuring that out is that, I mean, Bonhoeffer was sexist and class prejudiced, and in the case of the sexism, he wasn't at all ashamed of it. In the case of the class prejudice, Matthew's given us some very interesting indications of how he was starting to work that through. I mean, in this line of work, one gets used to that, basically, right? At least reading dead theologians. That's just what you live with. I confess, I have this alternative reality fantasy in which Dietrich survives the war and Maria re-educates him, but I'm not even sure I believe in that. And the more I struggle with this, the more I think I'm much less bothered about Dietrich having really significant limitations and blind spots than I am about contemporary readers trying to deny that those blind spots exist or make excuses for him. And I think this really comes back to what Kevin was saying about not making him the story, right? And how on his own terms it's really important not to make him the story. And that opens up the possibilities to say, well, yeah, these are all theologies written by people whose lives are broken up and messed up by structures in all kinds of ways, and that's just what we work with as a church. And actually there is something interesting there also about the nature of trust, right? Do we make it? Are we too inclined in a contemporary society to make it a prerequisite for trusting a person that they seem never to have made a mistake, as trusting a person or to have taken them seriously? So part of we are actually learning something about trust, about what it is to trust Bonhoeffer's voice and to trust Bonhoeffer's voice in the context of him as caught up in a lot of the bad stuff as well. Anyway, and the picture. Sorry, I should have said this is why the picture's there. sorry, I put that in late. This is about the other commitment that I guess I have developed in working on Bonhoeffer, in trying to think this through, which is to try as much as possible to see him in conversations, right? To avoid isolating him as the great man who does everything all by himself. I'm looking forward to reading Diane Reynolds' recent work. I don't know if anybody's beaten me to that on this work of non-fictional narration of Bonhoeffer in relation largely to the women in his life, including here most crucially his twin sister. Right? I mean, don't forget this. You know, his life was shaped by a dialogue all the way through, and it's remarkable. You think that must make a difference somewhere. Anyway, that's mainly background. I'll come on now. I'll talk a bit about the telling the truth essay. So I'm going to the place to start thinking about truth here. I'm going to the place I've actually frequently started for thinking with Bonhoeffer. This odd fragmentary essay, one of the last things he writes, entitled "What is it to tell the? What's it mean to tell the truth?" Now, folks in this room will know the background to the essay. It's written while under interrogation about the conspiracy. He's got his back to the wall, not only ethically but also spiritually, and we've had all these references to this sort of fragmentary nature of the writings that come out of this period, and all sorts of reasons why he can't fit it together. There's a genuine, in this context, there's a genuine and very urgent question, to quote it from elsewhere, of what do we really believe so that we would stake our lives on it? But there's also the need to make day-by-day decisions that could kill him or other people, right? Which actually, the more I think about it, the harder it gets to read the essay in a way, because then you think, well, this isn't really about the moral dilemma. You know, this is the moment. This is the moment in your sense. This is the crisis moment. But my general take on the essay is that the editors who decided to print it alongside the ethics were on the right lines, that it's of a piece with the pattern of theological thought about ethics, that although never turned into a finished volume, yeah, it's this unsystematic material that has a kind of coherence that it's reasonable to perceive in hindsight, right? We can make the connections. There's a work of making the connections for him that's worth doing. He could draw on that thought in a crisis and still end up saying things that were coherent. So if we're thinking about truth and Bonhoeffer, what do I want to focus on about how this essay works? So to me, the strength of the essay, thinking about truth, has always been that it first contextualises the particular act of truth-telling or lying, and then contextualises the context theologically, or to be more precise, Christologically. Right, so this is why I put in these quotations here. Telling the truth means different things depending on where one finds oneself. That's the context. The relevant relationships must be taken into account. And then the concretion. Then he sets a theological context, right? One owes truthful speech not to this or that person, but to God alone. So that's the wider context. You contextualise the context theologically, and then you say. And even God is not a general principle, but is the living one, right? So it's not just saying, oh, we need to see it all in a bigger picture. The bigger picture is precisely a Christ-centred bigger picture, right? So telling the truth requires attention to the real, to the place in which I stand. I'm quoting bits from the essay as I go, so you may pick bits. To the place in which I stand and the relationship between me and the other person and the subject matter. But it requires attention to all of this, the real as it is in God. That's the second quote you've got on your sheets. Our word in union with the word of God is intended to express what is real as it is in God. Coming back to it later. So that's much to say, which we all know, but apparently some folks don't, that it's not situation ethics. It's not straightforwardly an attack on Augustine, though it fairly obviously, for the reasons that have been given earlier, is an attack on Kant. And at the heart of it is the desire to take absolutely seriously the personal character of truth and the claim that Christ is the truth, the true word of God that sanctifies the believer, and the truth by which all true things are true. And that truth is a who, not a what. So back to this point about the who question. This is my comment here. The truthfulness that is not concrete is not truthful at all before God. Truth has a story and a name and an actually existing community. And the point would be then, I guess, that any criterion for truth or any account of what it means to tell the truth that's more abstract than that will at some point fail in its descriptive power. And conversely, an adequate way of describing what it means to tell the truth would need to carry at its centre something like the space of silence that's carried in those Christology lectures, right? So you remember the beginning of the Christology lectures, teaching about Christ begins in silence. And then you think, oh, well, that's nice, we sort of sit and contemplate stuff, and then you realise that's not what he's doing at all, because we're not sort of whizzing off into the negative theological stratosphere, and we're not sort of descending into embarrassed relativism and kind of dunno, right? But it's the kind of silence that is paying attention to the particular living, not captured by concepts, because it's living presence of the risen Christ, right? So this kind of silence that there is more presence here, there's more life here than can be spoken. That's the silence in the Christology lectures. And my point, which I take it, is reasonably uncontroversial, is that that's how the ethics tends to work as well, how Bonhoeffer's ethics tends to work as well, right? He makes the equivalent of what, in the Christology lectures, he describes how Chalcedon works, right? He says, you've got all of these over-systematising approaches that you don't have, that it cuts off, right? So you don't talk about change, you don't talk about confusion, you don't talk about division, you don't talk about separation, because all of those are ways of conceptually neatening the incarnation, right? So he says that's how it works with Christology, and then when he does ethics, he tends to do something similar. Say, we're going to cut off the over pragmatism and revolutionary idealism. We're going to cut off, radicalism, compromise. We're going to cut all these off because they're neat solutions, formulaic solutions. And then, of course, in ethics, he demonstrates, without making too many bones about it, that getting this wrong, deciding you're going to solve your ethical problems with a formula, is not just inaccurate, but deathly. Yes, and that's all of a piece with the Christocentric approach to ethics, to which Christ as the real one is central. Right? This is what I like about the telling the truth stuff, is because truth is a term that crosses the boundary between theology and ethics. It makes it fairly clear how the two weave together. So when you get to telling the truth as an ethical issue, as a sub-ethical issue, do you say this, do you say that? You can still say that truthfulness is conformity of the word with the real. But that's kind of a point about ethics in general, as well as a point about truth-telling, right? So the core of ethics as such is conformity to Christ as the real one, right? So you have a truth is correspondence of word and thing, right? But he's actually bringing that becomes sort of metonymic for how the whole of ethics works, right? So it's the conformity of the word, speech as action, with the real one who is Christ, something like that. So to think about the assigned purpose of words and silence, as Bonhoeffer does here, so this is a kind of call for thinking about truth, is a word in union with the word of God is intended to express what is real as it is in God. Now silence is to be the sign of the boundary drawn around the word by what is real. So this is this sense that is this restriction of the over-conceptualising move, the schematising move. So to think about the assigned purpose of words and silence, as Bonhoeffer does here, is not just to allow for all the things that all ethicists know they've got to allow for, particularity and context and concretion and narrative. The reference to reality as it is in God, I would assume, is supposed to protect that specific, concrete, particular situation or individual from being swallowed up in any supposedly exhaustive description of context, right? Being reduced to characteristics or context, because sometimes contextualising is just another way of getting a grip on something, right? Only a slightly cleverer one with a different set of terms, right? And so the way he contextualises the context theologically is to make it properly ungraspable. That's the anti-systematic use of Christology in Bonhoeffer. I kind of think that's all reasonably uncontroversial. Maybe you're going to tell me some of it is, I don't know. So that's all me saying kind of good things about Bonhoeffer and how it works. So, and one of the other things that I think is useful about the essay, the way it works, is the way it crosses or confuses the boundary between theology and ethics. So it's not just that, an obvious way you might think it crosses the boundary with theology, and this is going back to the paper earlier about with the centrality of address, the word as address. So you might think one reason that this crosses the boundary into theology is that telling the truth about the world, well, maybe the core form of that is proclamation, or it's preaching. So that's one way it works. But there's also the fact that within this way of thinking, speech, to say stuff, is a kind of action, and it's a way of forming or performing relationships. And that lets you widen out the question. How do our actions and our ways of forming and performing relationships reflect or betray the truth, reflect or betray the given truth that we and our neighbours are all and each sinning creatures beloved of God? So that's why I've got the quote about relationships, right? Every word I speak stands on the stipulation that it be true. And then, this is the kicker that I like, quite apart from the truthfulness of its content, the relationship it expresses between me and another person is already true or untrue. And that's where I find the interesting bridge into thinking about systems and institutions. Right. Because, I mean, it's quite easy to swallow this sort of thing up, isn't it, into a kind of ethics of encounter where, I mean, so this is again picking up on the stuff in Matt's paper, but the really key thing is to sit down and talk to individuals, you know, so your image becomes, it's always me and the other, me and the other, me and the other. Another thing that I like about this kind of work, about this essay, is that at the same time as pointing back to this radically unsystematic Christocentrism, it's extremely serious in some way about systems and institutions. And at least alive, I think, to the dangers of collapsing everything system-related or institution-related into the personal encounter. So we're going to get to all the difficulties of this in a minute, but I want to acknowledge that Bonhoeffer at least lets you be serious about acknowledging a complex range of relationships of proximity and distance, asymmetries of power, asymmetries of knowledge. He puts all of these at play within the essay. Role, and those are relationships, but also those are relationships which have roles constituted by them, right? The roles that don't come close to defining who a person is, right? So you know, the identity of a person isn't swallowed up in being a teacher or a parent or whatever, but they do say something worth saying about a person's responsibilities, opportunities, and constraints that's not theologically irrelevant. Which opens up, I think, a really important space for talking about truthfulness and falsity on a more than individual level, on the level of the institution. So the biographical thing here is that when I was being asked to deliver far too many meaningless, or in some cases actually invented, statistics to a university bureaucracy, I found it very helpful to be able to think with Bonhoeffer about the possibility of making sense of a system or an institution that makes it hard to tell the truth, right? So I felt like I was being put in a situation where I was being asked to say something, and there wasn't actually anything truthful that I could say, right? You know, I'm going to have to make it up, or I'm going to have to give you some numbers which I know are not real. Yeah, so how's this work? You can have systems or institutions that make it hard to tell the truth. And I didn't want to go all Foucauldian, cynical, and disengage on the basis that every human-made regime of truth is equally a lie. It's quite tempting sometimes. Michael and I were talking about this earlier. Too much of an institutional animal. I wanted to hold on to the possibility of being able to inhabit institutions critically and think about the sorts of limited goods that they do. And the idea, the fact that Bonhoeffer was both on one hand acknowledging that you could have contexts of relationship that were so distorting of a situation that you didn't know what was true anymore, or what it meant to speak truth anymore, and was recognising that there really are institutions, there really are within which people operate, like there really are shapings of relationships by inner-worldly structures which need to be paid attention to. This seemed worthwhile. So my sort of wider questions about systemic built-in untruthfulness come back to in a minute. But then that leads us on to some of the rather obvious problems, right, with the way that the essay works. So now we're going to start poking some critical questions in Dietrich's direction. The way in which it falls back on the reliability and reality of certain kinds of institutions. So those of you who know the essay probably would have seen what's coming. But those of you that don't, we'll take a minute to look at this. This is the example that is given of, so in Bonhoeffer's terms, what this is an example of is getting a set of relationships wrong in such a way that the previous criteria about truth and falsity don't apply. So he writes, let's remember this example, when the various orders of life no longer respect one another, then words become untrue. For example, a teacher asks a child in front of the class whether it's true that the child's father often comes home drunk. It's true, but the child denies it. To be sure, the child perceives that this question is an unjustified invasion into the order of the family and must be warded off. The teacher disregards the reality of this order. In responding, the child would have to find a way to observe equally the orders of the family and those of the school. The child cannot do this yet. He or she lacks the experience, the discernment, and the capability for appropriate expression. Okay, maybe I'm the only person who finds this really disturbing. I find this really disturbing. Possibly because I spent longer than I probably should have for my general love of humanity, reading some of the transcripts of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And in those scripts, in those transcripts, records of what has happened, particularly within churches in this case, it's very striking how the apparent and assumed naturalness of the power relations involved, of certain kinds of roles and certain kinds of orders and certain kinds of structures that were to be kept in place, and nobody was to ask about what was going on inside them, so on and so forth. Certain kinds of divisions of spheres and orders of respecting each other, as well as the assumption that it's problematic to talk about sex in more or less any context, led to sustained untruthfulness in all the senses you care to name. This is, I think, one of the things we've learned from ICSA. All the senses you care to name, from good old Augustinian lies, I mean, people did just like say stuff that wasn't true, to persistent and dramatic failures to see what was going on, to a more Bonhoefferian one, if you like, deep implication in the ongoing failure to witness to the reality, to who the victims and the perpetrators are, failure of witness. And to put it bluntly, I'm not sure I would trust someone who was acting just on the basis of this kind of material in the truth essay to do any better if they were in charge. Because of what doesn't get challenged, namely certain kinds of paternalistic, clerical statesmen like, all of the Stellvertreter figures, all of the people that get to make the decision, their power to decide what should and shouldn't be talked about. It's the disturbing side of some of the, which has come up quite a lot as we've talked, particularly struck by this paper on which I think is completely right. There is just an emphasis here on the assumptions about the role of power. The question is, how is power going to be constrained and how is it going to be used appropriately? Where does that leave the powerless person in this situation? Okay, I mean that might seem like that's sort of fairly boring feminist point, but it's kind of got to be made because people do still use this stuff. Yeah, people do still use people use the truth essay, and we need to take a critical look at it. There's a theological concern here linked to it, that Bonhoeffer's emphasis on the concrete or the real, which is absolutely key, as we've heard all over today, to his Christology and his anthropology, does seem to have this bias towards treating existing roles and relationships, which means, among other things, existing power relations, right, and the institutions that constitute them, as integral to the real. And then incorporating them in a certain conditioned way, so now we're back to the mandate, into, let's put a soteriological scheme, it's into an account of salvation history, broadly, is it? Because they're not salvific in themselves, but they do still get fitted into the scheme. As relative and significantly qualified goods as those infamous divine mandates under the general heading of the orders of preservation. So the point is that you've got this scheme where you've got the mandates, you've got the orders of preservation. I'm curious about the extent to which, in practical examples worked through in the ethics, what we get is an assumption that that means the institutions that we have, or the power relations that we have, right? and that gets put on the side of the real and the concrete, right? What's real and what's concrete is what we've got, yeah? You can see why that works, right? You can see why that works. It's part of this opposition to the abstract ideal, right? So yeah, he doesn't want total, the revolutionary who dreams up what the world could be like and then goes out to smash up everything we've got and build something different. He says, well, this is clearly very destructive. But the question is how you stop opposition to the imagined possible. So you have this idea of we can't rush towards the imagined possible because that's ignoring the real. It becomes destructive of the real. How does that flip over? How do we stop that flipping over into refusal to rock the boat, or basic default position small c conservatism with all that might benefit in terms of keeping the existing power relations in place? The thing is that the annoying thing, the reason I kind of go on with Dietrich, obviously, is that penultimacy is meant to deal with all that, right? By, as it were, it kind of temporalises the real. It's the real as it exists in God, so that was on the previous slide, is real insofar, so the mandates, the orders of preservation, it has its reality, it has its value insofar as it prepares the way for it, precedes it, points towards Christ. It has no independent validity. So that, I mean, actually, if we just go back to the previous slide, a couple back, sorry. So there's something interesting there, actually, about the real as it exists in God. It's the as it exists in God isn't, if you take that penultimacy seriously, the reality of the penultimate is dependent on the reality of Christ, then anything that you're going to label as the real as it exists in God is not like a little extra layer that you add on the top of a bunch of reality that you already know. Right? It changes the nature of what it is for this real to be real, or it should do, if we think about it that way. It also kind of seems to me that if we are rethinking the real as penultimate, the real as it exists in God as penultimate, that ought to relativise somewhat the distinction between the historical present real, right? So the actual, the roles that I currently hold and the way they are currently configured within the institutions within which I exist, and the historical future possible, right? So clearly, a future possible state of affairs, like, I don't know, a less patriarchal academia, or a just culture for the NHS, or, whatever you like, a church that was able to communicate better about safeguarding and child abuse. All of these future possible states of affairs, yeah, sure, they're a bit abstract and ideal when they're in my head. They have the character of possibility. But here's a point. So, insofar as it's in my head, is the really existing patriarchy or the culture of blame, right? Either of them, as thought about, is the abstract ideal. And none of them has any self-standing right to exist. So there's something about, and I think we might want to think this through a bit in relation to the discussion on Kevin's paper. There's something about how the temporality of everything that comes under the heading of penultimate is to be thought. And it picks up on this idea that was raised in the conversation earlier about the mandates as dynamic. And I guess what I'm interested in now, thinking about trusted institutions, is how that dynamism might be thought. And because it seems to me that there's nothing inherent in the way Bonhoeffer sets things up that should prevent that kind of dynamism, but there's a whole lot in the way that he writes about them that generally does. Right? So this default to what we've got is basically okay, and imagining it any different is jumping out of it rather than thinking critically within it. And so I'm interested in how it changes from being thought about critically within in the light of the big theological frame, the big context. And that's where I find I need to bring in some help. So I'm going to bring in some help, which is actually also picking up on that tantalising passage on the view from below, which we had acknowledged in an earlier paper before, and also on the fiction from prison, all these bits where Bonhoeffer kind of acknowledges, but doesn't on my reading really know what to do with, the idea that he really can't see it all from where he sits. He really can't see it all from where he sits. So how do we think about that? Now I've got to jump forward a bit, excuse me. Here we are. Yeah. So at this point, something I find interesting is a dialogue with womanist theological ethicist Emily Towns, who puts forward in her work the idea of the true, which she opposes to, the almost true, the sometimes true, and the half true. This here is just an extract from a convocation address, and she's written about it in more length elsewhere. So for Towns, the true is in, this is quoting her again, all the memories, not just the ones that are selected and held up. So paradigmatically, it's the stories of struggle and survival from the underside of history, the view from below, if you like, coming into expression as it emerges into visibility and audibility, particularly, again, in her work in non-elite cultural and religious forms. The key thing about it is that, about the true, is that it is the concrete lived reality that escapes or is not recognised by or captured by the abstract ideal, right? And Bonhoeffer wants to talk about that as well, but the key point about the way Towns does it is she gives it a social political location, right? And by thinking about it in the true in this way, she makes it clear that it is the future potential of the present, right? So the true is coming into expression. You see it emerging. She talks about it as emergent. She talks about it as interruptive, disruptive. She talks about it as the future on its way. It's related to the real life transformation of material circumstances. In my reading of Towns, it's when she's talking about with the true is not just like that. The easily discernible appearance of Christ in history, or whatever. But it is true in the sense that it is the truth that is validated as true by the resurrected body of a victim of institutional power. So I think Bonhoeffer's account of Christ as the real needs to be matched with something like an account of the truth, the true, as emergent from the view from below, or something like this. So it's the idea of the true is recognisably made true by the resurrected body of a victim of institutionalised power, a body that's the body of Christ that still bears and displays wounds, and that reconstitutes death-dealing patterns of relationship from within. So I think what I want to say, reading Towns alongside Bonhoeffer, trying to get them into some kind of conversation, is that the penultimate, the institution, the relationships of closeness and distance and imbalance of power and knowledge and so on, within which we shamble along trying to tell truth to each other, it doesn't have to be stable or something that already exists. It has to be livable, but that means it has to be really livable, it has to be compatible, it has to be in some kind of conversation with the true, which includes not just answerable to the victims of institutions, but aligned with their longing for more livable futures. I mean, that might sound quite kind of aspirational and general. I think I've talked for quite a long time. I've got some more to say. Is it okay if I go on talking? I'll go on talking a bit. I shouldn't ask the audience that. I think there's ways in which it can become very concrete. So it would be to say that truthful relationships to institutes and power structures includes partiality, provisionality, temporality in relation to the structures. Institutions becoming learning institutions. What does it mean for to develop a learning culture, to develop a just culture? It actually picks up on Cameron Guth's suggestion made some years ago that the mandates can be genuine communities of argument. She got this idea from Catherine Tanner. So partly thinking about, well, how do we shift to make this a community of argument? But it's not quite an argument. It's about why do the reform of institutions, they're turning around from within, that doesn't amount to restoration of a pre-given order, but serves precisely preservation, life-giving practices. Because the other point about Towns' true is that you say, well, these are the stories of struggle to survive, right? This is the idea that actually the preservation isn't quite working yet. It's not working for everyone. It's not working like it should be. It's all within the penultimate sphere, right, isn't it? None of this makes the kingdom come, but it is a genuine question about preservation and survival. And this does require, I think, rather precisely thinking beyond Bonhoeffer, because it requires writing the chapters that he never got round to writing. I genuinely think, you know, in the set of dialogues that you can write these. I think the thing that I want to say towards the end is about the question where this leaves us with questions about trust in institutions, and the way I want to think about. I'm experimenting with thinking beyond Bonhoeffer in this way, is about the urgent need in our time to discriminate appropriately in the interests of placing trust appropriately and also demanding trust appropriately. So thinking not just about what it is or isn't okay to say, which is the telling the truth question, but what or whom it's right to trust, both in the sense of what or whom we rely on to handle truth, and what or whom we learn to hear truth from. So, you know, who handles confidentiality, and which news sources you read, all these kinds of questions. So I'm interested in looking at the question of truth almost the other way around. Where do you put your trust? To whom do you pay attention? And the idea that the purpose of trust and our trusting is to reflect or bear witness to reality as it exists in God, because it seems reasonably clear that trust and good listening, considering the place in which I stand, the person to which I attend, the subject matter, and thinking about what's the appropriate relationship of trust here, is something that must be learned. Like one of us says, speaking the truth must be. And it's kind of a hidden and rather important prerequisite for speaking the truth. It's the hidden background of all of the relationships within the mandates, all of the relationships with institutions. How a child trusts a parent, and vice versa. Because, I don't know, we never had kids. If you've had kids, you know that you don't control them like you think, how a patient trusts a doctor, and vice versa. Right? How a manager trusts a professional employee or not, and vice versa. Yeah? How the congregation trusts the pastor, and vice versa. And my proposal, which isn't really very radical, is that we put these relationships of trust, which I think in the way, as far as Bonhoeffer got to writing it, he tended to just take as given, yeah, as a thing, that we put them to the same kind of question to which he puts the practice of telling the truth. Yeah? What kinds of structured relationships of trust and structured relationships of trust, so institutions, are capable of acknowledging reality as it exists in God, capable of being truthful? What kinds of relationships can you tell the truth within? He doesn't really ask that. It's curious. And this is my really, really, really rough sketch for how any of that might work. I mean, one is to say that the institutions we have, the professions, yeah, the workplaces, the family, the church as organisation, right? You know, the bits of the church that handle safeguarding work, are ways of preserving trust. Preserve it, because trust starts off as a given. I think theologically it's right to say, to understand human relationships first as gift, right? To understand the first thing is we are given to each other to depend on each other. That's a condition of creatureliness, right? Trust is a feature of creatureliness. It's not, you know, we don't sort of start off as independent, freestanding individuals and then start trusting people. We're thrown into trusting people. So institutions hold the trust that's essential, hold and direct and shape the trust that's essential for society. They are also spaces of, the Bonhoeffer's terms about truth, disunion and contradiction, betrayal. And they just are. They're places where trust is broken all the time and have to be organised in ways that recognise the inevitability of breach of trust. And then the tricky one, there's always three, right? There's always three, is that institutions are sites of, I wanted to say reconciliation, but then I decided I'd take the term Emily Towns uses, that she prefers, it's term mediation. Because if you say reconciliation, that sounds as though you're finishing it and bringing about the kingdom of God, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the historical process whereby the possibility of a better way of doing this particular institution within history comes to be imagined, comes to emerge from a historical context, and comes to be, it is worked through. And that's not finishing it and making a perfect family or a perfect state or a perfect NHS or whatever. But it is, it's emphasised the process character of change in the penultimate, doesn't produce the end result. And also the significance of conflict, handling conflict. So something about, I'm thinking again about it with Matthew's paper, that there's something about Bonhoeffer handling conflict that I've never been quite convinced about, right? You know, this argument between Christoph and Heinrich. So But that's an argument worth having, right? That's kind of how life is. You should be listening. The view from below, just because you hear the view from below doesn't mean chaos is erupted. So thinking about institutions as sites of mediation in that sense. So I think it's suggesting in that way understanding institutions in the context of the orders of preservation. Then I had the final thought about accountability. Is the idea that we can work on systems of accountability as ways of creating trust within institutions, of preserving trust within institutions. As, again, structures of relationship within which telling the truth about the real as it is in God is possible. Which doesn't mean just putting everything out in the open, right? It's about, primarily, it's about the care for the other as gift, and it's about the ability to recognise and speak about the depth of brokenness of things. And it's about building into accountability the process, the possibility of learning to do a bit more justice. Right. So this is the way I'm trying to think about that. All of which is probably kind of a long apologia for doing management stuff and trying to do it better. But I'm hoping that there's some points of connection there, both with theology, with ethics, and with contemporary questions. And if folk would like to discuss it, I'd really love to hear what you've got to say. Thank you.